Welcome to Section 3 of Part 3 of the training course on demographic evaluation of age and sex data. This is the last part of the training course. In Part 3, we first began by explaining the idea of Beer's interpolation, a method of splitting data in five-year age groups or 5 calendar year groups into single years of age or single calendar years. In Part 2, we applied and made use of that Beer's interpolation to be able to begin an evaluation of data on the age of mothers giving birth. In this final part of the training workshop, we're going to conduct a similar exercise to evaluate the data on the age at death. Much of the information contained in this video is similar to that contained in Part 3, Section 2. However, there are some important differences which are worth drawing out. When looking at data on age at death, there are 3 potential sources of data. The first and most useful is that from a civil registration system. The WHO recommends that dates of birth and death, and therefore one is able to calculate an age at death, is captured in the civil registration of deaths. The second source of data would be that from surveys. However, most surveys are simply not large enough to collect information on age at death. In the general context, deaths are relatively rare events, and so one needs a very large sample size to produce reliable estimates on the number of deaths in a population. However, one might still be able to derive useful information about the age of death of children under 5, for example, from a demographic and health survey. Likewise, a demographic and health survey routinely asks a module on siblinghood survival, that is, the survival of the siblings of the respondent. Typically, this is only asked of sisters in a DHS. Furthermore, while asking respondents about the survival of their sisters does significantly increase the sample size available for understanding patterns of mortality, there are several important and quite intricate theoretical considerations relating to the analysis of siblinghood survival data from a DHS. This is unfortunately beyond the scope of this training workshop, but if using data from a sibling survival module from a DHS, it is incumbent for the analyst to understand what the potential sources of bias and error in those data might be. The third source of data, which could be used to understand and evaluate age patterns at death, would be data from a census. Many censuses include a module which asks about deaths which occurred in the household in the year before the census. These data are often useful and might provide a useful test against the data from a civil registration system, for example. But the data collected on household deaths in the last year do suffer from a number of limitations. Amongst other things, households might disintegrate or collapse on the death of a particular member of the household, and the members of the household then join other households. You might also encounter reference period errors, where when asking about deaths which occurred in the precise 12 months before the census, there might be inclusion or exclusion of deaths which did occur or didn't occur in the data. In preparing your source data, if one is using information from a civil registration system or a survey, what one is looking for is to produce a tabulation of deaths registered or occurring in a given calendar year or given calendar years by sex and age at death. Ideally, we would want those deaths to be adjusted for late registration, as described in the recent guidelines for estimating completeness of civil registration of vital events produced by ESCAP. Having produced that tabulation of deaths, we would then want to ensure that those deaths are grouped into the conventional demographic 5-year age groups, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, and so on. The choice of the open interval, that last age group, which includes all deaths above a certain age, might be constrained by the data available to you or provided to you. In any event, the UNWPP produces tabulations of deaths by age, which have an open interval of age 95 and older. So that has to be the extreme upper bound of the open interval of the data you use. You might have to use an open interval of, say, 80 and over or 85 and older, in which case the process is exactly the same as before, but one would then combine the data from the UNWP tabulations to conform with the open interval available to you. If one is working with data from a census, that is the household deaths module, what one would want is a tabulation of deaths in the year before the census by age and sex, and then further grouped into the conventional age groups. To give you a graphic idea of what the input source data which one requires would look like, this is South African vital registration data for males from the period 2000 to 2015 and for ages 0 to 4 up to 60 to 64. There is data for other ages beyond that, but they did not fit onto the screen. We can see, however, that in the calendar year 2000, there were 27,192 deaths of males registered in South Africa of those aged between 0 to 4. In terms of preparing the counterfactual data, you might use any population projection output, for example, from Spectrum, a suite of population projection software, or internally or nationally produced population projections, as long as those projections produce an estimate of the number of deaths by age group and sex. And those are routinely produced by most population projections. The recommendation, however, in this training workshop is to use the most current national level projections produced by the UN Population Division, the UN World Population Prospects. While we hold those to be the most useful set of population projections, always bear in mind that there are some limitations to the UN World Population Prospects. Firstly, there are no projections available at a subnational level. So if you are wanting to examine the age profile and the pattern of deaths by age at a subnational level, at a province or a district or a city, you would not be able to use the UN World Population Prospects to produce a counterfactual, and you might have to make use of an internally or nationally produced population projection for that province or that district or that city. And as we saw with the data which we used to create the evaluation and the counterfactual for the evaluation of ages of mother at birth, we will need to manipulate the available output from the UNWPP to produce the counterfactual estimate of number of deaths by age group and sex for a given calendar year. However, unlike the UNWPP data, which we use to derive the estimates and the age profile of mothers giving birth, the published UNWPP death data lend themselves far more directly for use as a counterfactual source of data. We'll be drawing on tabulations of the number of deaths by 5-year age groups and in 5-year calendar periods, which are provided for males and females separately by the UNWPP. We will then, as we did equivalently with the data on ages of mother at birth, we will derive estimates of deaths by sex by 5-year age groups for each calendar year from the 5 calendar year data in the UNWPP by applying Beer's interpolation to those estimates. And so the summary of the recommended approach is that we will be applying Beer's interpolation to the UNWPP deaths by sex, which are published in 5 calendar year periods, to derive an estimate of the annual deaths by age group and sex. However, after applying Beer's interpolation, those resulting number of deaths on an annual basis apply from the middle of one year to the middle of the next. And in order to produce estimates on a calendar year basis, we'll then use linear interpolation to get calendar year specific deaths. As we noted with the evaluation of data on ages of mothers giving birth, the UNWPP produces an estimate of the total number of deaths by calendar year in the conventional calendar years. And so we will be rescaling the estimated number of deaths derived from applying the Beers interpolation and then annualizing it. We'll be rescaling those estimates to match again the UNWPP estimates of the total number of deaths by calendar year. However, it should be noted that this approach of rescaling might be problematic in some contexts where mortality in particular age groups is changing rapidly. For example, with the passage of an HIV/AIDS epidemic. Caution should therefore be adopted, especially if the overall error is marked, where we define that error to be the estimated annual deaths, which we have derived relative to the UNWPP annual deaths. And we'll be looking at this when we explore it in the spreadsheet, which accompanies this training workshop. All the preceding steps, that is, the various interpolations, are automated in a spreadsheet that is available on the workshop training drive. The spreadsheet, which is provided, covers all countries covered by the UNWPP and for all calendar years from 2000 to 2028. I'm now going to demonstrate that spreadsheet to show how it works, and the spreadsheet is labeled DTW for Demographic Training Workshop _Beers _UNWPP.xlsx. This is the spreadsheet, which has been designed to accompany this training workshop. It is the same spreadsheet used to demonstrate the application of Beers interpolation to the data on births demonstrated in the previous video. But the tab, which has now been revealed, unlike the video from the previous section, now includes the possibility of doing Beers interpolation relative to the number of deaths. In this spreadsheet, there are two inputs which need to be selected. The first is a drop-down box, which includes all the countries included in the UNWPP. So I will choose South Africa. The second drop-down box requires that you select either male deaths or female deaths as the basis of your counterfactual, which you will be comparing with your own data, your own source data. Based on those two selections, the country and the sex of the deaths which one is looking at, the spreadsheet automatically populates these green shaded cells with the data from the UNWPP. And these show, for example, that the male deaths in 1,000 from the UNWPP in the 5-year calendar periods produced by the UNWPP. So this suggests here that there were approximately 185,000 male deaths aged 0 to 4 in the period from mid-1995 to mid-2000. As with the spreadsheet on births, what we then do is we have to transpose that matrix so that the ages run down the rows and the 5-year calendar periods run across the columns. Having done that, we then apply Beers interpolation to produce an estimate of the number of annual deaths in years running from the middle of one year to the middle of the next by those 5-year age groups. So this number of 29,829 suggests that according to the UNWPP and after application of the Beers interpolation method, there were 29,829 deaths of males between mid-1995 and mid-1996. We then take those estimates of deaths running from the middle of one year to the middle of the next and use straightforward linear interpolation to recast those into the annual deaths by age group in a given calendar year running from the 1st of January to the 31st of December in that year. And we can see, for example, that in the calendar year 2000, that estimate is the average of the deaths which were available or estimated for the mid-1999 to mid-2000 and mid-2000 to mid-2001. Having produced those estimates now of deaths in calendar years running from January to December by age group, we can sum up those total number of deaths. In this case, in that calendar year of 2000, it's suggesting 311,000 deaths. And we can compare those with the estimate produced by the UNWPP for males in that calendar year. The error is the ratio of the UNWPP deaths to the total number of deaths observed. And we can see that unlike the data on births, these errors tend to be far more substantial. In the case of South Africa, this arises because of the impacts of HIV and AIDS and the fact that the Beers interpolation over 5-year periods and condensing those 5-year estimates into single years of age is less than ideal. But nevertheless, the error is typically only of the order of 3%. If we look at the case of, say, Thailand, however, to give you a sense of where the data are less affected by rapid changes in mortality, we will see that the errors are now substantially lower, in no case running to more than about 0.5% overall. And so we are relatively content with our process of estimating those number of deaths. As we did with the information on the ages of mothers giving birth, we do, however, want to rescale those numbers of births, and in this case, number of deaths, so that the total number of deaths matches that on an annual basis, matches that with the UNWPP. And this is done by rescaling the numbers so that they do match. And the results are contained in these yellow shaded cells beginning at cell B21 of the output spreadsheet. And we'll be taking this matrix of results as the counterfactual for our comparisons with our data from our source. When comparing the source and counterfactual data, you can then set about drawing the comparisons between them after you've prepared the source and counterfactual data as I've described. If your source data come from a survey or not nationally representative in scale, in other words, in terms of the absolute numbers of deaths, you will not be able to compare those numbers of deaths with the UNWPP and will have to rely on comparison only of the proportional distribution of ages at death from the survey with the proportional distributions of ages at death estimated from the UNWPP. If one's working with vital registration data at a national level, this should not be a problem. In drawing those comparisons of data from your source and your counterfactual data, you're really only limited by your imagination and what you see in your initial analyses and by the data you have. Unfortunately, data from a household deaths module in a census will be far more sparse than the data which might be available to you from vital registration systems. But some useful starting points for those investigations are suggested below. For a given year, for a given age group or across age groups, one could ask how well do the estimates of the number of deaths by sex from your source and counterfactual data, how well do they line up? Equally, we could look at the proportional distribution of ages at death by sex and compare those between the source and the counterfactual data. Because we have both the source and the counterfactual data, we might also be able to derive estimates of the completeness of deaths by sex and by age group for a given calendar year. And we might also want to look at trends in completeness in a given age group over time. But as I've noted, at this stage in the analysis, you're really only limited by your imagination and by the data available to you. I'm going to show an example of how this might be conducted using the data for South Africa. The data now available and shown on your screen are available on the training workshop drive. What we have here, in the case of South Africa, and data from our vital registration system, are the deaths recorded in our vital registration system by calendar year and by age group, and those were extracted from our vital registration system. Further along, beginning at column Y, we include the information from the UNWPP data of the estimated number of male deaths by year of death and by age group, as we derived in the previous spreadsheet. And we paste those values in there. And we'll just run a quick check to make sure that the total number is what it was in the previous spreadsheet. The first step, then, would be to derive a proportional age distribution of those male deaths. This is a sheet for male deaths. There's a similar one for female deaths. And we'll derive the proportional age distribution of male deaths. And so this here shows that in the calendar year 2000, of all the deaths in calendar year 2000, 12.1% of them occurred to children aged 0 to 4 for males. And we can see that that proportion of the deaths in that age group is falling over time. We would do the same exercise of deriving the proportional age distribution of deaths for males from the UNWPP. And if you are working with your own data, it is recommended that you take the spreadsheet as a starting point and you use it to build your own one for conducting your own analyses. What we can then do is we can say, for example, for a given calendar year, let's say, for example, for 2017, we could compare the results of our data, our source data, with that of the UNWPP. We could compare the observed distribution of deaths. You can see now that for calendar year 2017, the spreadsheet looks up the value of the proportion of deaths, of male deaths, age 0 to 4 out of all the deaths in 2017, 8.7%, and we will look up the equivalent value from the UNWPP data, 7.8% is provided there. We could also extract the observed numbers of deaths of males aged 0 to 4 in 2017. For example, we can see there's 21,718 in the vital registration data and 23,264 amongst the data from the UNWPP. We could, by changing this year, the matrix of these outputs is automatically recalibrated and re-looked up for the correct year which you have chosen. But let's leave it at 2017 for the purposes of this demonstration. We can then do two graphs. The first on the left-hand side here is the number of male deaths by age. The black line showing the observed numbers from the vital registration system. The blue line showing the estimated number of deaths by age for males in South Africa in 2017 from the UNWPP. The right-hand figure shows the age distribution of those deaths. In other words, taking out the effect of the different number of the deaths estimated. We can look at this and we can see, for example, that in general, these age distributions are broadly similar, although the UNWPP distribution seems to suggest that the deaths are coming through at an older age than we are seeing in our own vital registration data. And that would be something which would need to be investigated to work out whether this is because the UNWPP data, for example, have misapplied or have a different age distribution of deaths implied in their mortality rates than is being observed in South Africa. Overall, though, the shape of these deaths is broadly similar. That's the level and quantities of the deaths are in quite strong agreement. We can further derive an estimate of the completeness of the male deaths in South Africa in 2017 by dividing the observed number of deaths in that age group 0 to 4 in 2017 by the UN estimates, the estimates derived from the UNWPP data for 2017, and that will give us an estimate of the completeness of the death registrations by age for males in that calendar year. It's important to note, however, that when we look at this plot of the completeness, that it appears that the completeness of death registrations of male children aged between 5 to 9 is particularly low. But your attention is drawn to the fact that these numbers themselves are very, very small, and it might be related to very small differences in the estimated level of mortality by age, in that age group 5 to 9, between the UNWPP estimates, which the mortality rates which inform those estimates, and the observed numbers. We can do a similar exercise for the data on females, where again, we extract our input data from our vital registration of female deaths by age and calendar year. We would include the female deaths by age and calendar year estimated from the interpolated UNWPP data. And we could do exactly the same exercise again of deriving the proportional age distribution of female deaths from our source data, as well as the proportional age distribution of female deaths estimated from the interpolated UNWPP data. And we could then compare for a given year. In this sheet, it is the calendar year which one is comparing has been set to be the same for females as for males, so that one can draw direct comparisons of male and female deaths. As before, we could then produce a plot of the number of female deaths by age in South Africa for 2017, shown here on the left, and the age distribution of female deaths in South Africa in 2017. It's noteworthy that certainly the age distribution of female deaths from observed in the vital registration data and from the interpolated UNWPP data is much closer than it was in the case of males. And that might point to the fact of differential assumptions of male mortality, particularly in the UNWPP data. Again, we can see that there's particularly low estimates of completeness amongst women aged 5 to 9, girls aged 5 to 9 in South Africa in 2017, where the estimated completeness falls to around 60%. But again, here you can see that the numbers of those deaths are indeed very small. And so the difference might arise from fairly small differences in the assumed level of mortality in the UNWPP relative to what has actually been experienced. Having done that for both males and females, we can then compare the estimated completeness by sex and age group for South Africa in 2017, and we can plot the male and female completeness against each other. A value of 1 here would imply 100% completeness. What we can see is, again, we see it much lower completeness amongst children aged 5 to 9. But in general, over much of the adult age range, say from about age 35 to about age 75, the estimates of completeness are largely constant and level, and that provides some indication as to your overall level of completeness in those age groups. At the extreme ends of the age range, we can see that the estimates of completeness start diverging very rapidly. And we saw this in the plots over here of female deaths and the age distribution of those female deaths, and the plots of male deaths and the age distribution of those male deaths. And this might be because the UNWPP estimates of extreme old age mortality are too heavy. And that is something which would need to be investigated further. It is unlikely that there's age exaggeration, for example, in the observed deaths reported into the South African vital registration system, because those are derived from the reported dates of birth and the reported dates of death. So just to reiterate, here's the plots for South Africa for females for 2017. Again, we see the number of female deaths by age, the age distribution of those female deaths by age, and by and large, they would seem to indicate that overall, the reported deaths in South Africa do conform quite strongly with those estimated from the UNWPP data, except perhaps at the oldest ages, and that would be a matter for further investigation. We can derive a plot of the completeness, estimates of completeness of female deaths by age group for that calendar year or for any other calendar year from the spreadsheet which I've just demonstrated. And we can do the same thing for males and female and the completeness of male deaths by age group for South Africa in that calendar year. And finally, as I just demonstrated, one could then produce a combined plot of the estimated completeness by sex and age for any given year. As I noted in discussing the results from the investigations and the evaluation of data of ages of mother at birth, the same considerations apply here. When confronted by a discrepancy between two estimates, either or both may be the source of the disagreement, and consequently untangling of those discrepancies requires further work and investigation as to what might explain them. Part of that requires a detailed understanding of the possible sources, of the possible kinds of errors which might prevail in your source data, and a detailed understanding of the data and the methods used in the derivation of the counterfactual, for example, the UNWPP data. Finally, to end off this video, if you have any questions or queries or comments on this material, please email me, thomas.moultrie@un.org, and copy that email to escapcrvs@un.org. I will do my best to answer the questions either by return of email or in the first plenary session, where we'll convene on the 27th of May, 2022. I look forward to meeting you there, and thank you very much for your time and attention and participation in this training workshop. I look forward to working with you. Thank you very much.